Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss Ash Wednesday, which this year falls on February 17th. During our discussion of the second reading from Isaiah, we discuss white fragility and the concept of white women tears. And during the discussion for the gospel reading, there is a conversation about a dystopian fictional series that involves child murder and dismemberment.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Today, for our deep dive, we have our special guest, Crystal Cheatham, who is the creator of the Our Bible app. She is also the host of Lord Have Mercy, a podcast about God, sex, and the Bible, and has been featured in Teen Vogue, Autostraddle, and LGBTQ Nation, amongst others.
Welcome!
Yay!
It's good to have you with us on the podcast today, Crystal. I have been a fan of the Our Bible app since its early days, and so we were super excited for Nerds at Church to be on the Our Bible app, but not all of our listeners are familiar with it. So can you tell us a little bit about what it is and why it is?
Yeah, Emily, it's actually really nice to be here with y'all. When you submitted your podcast to the app, I got excited about it because we're nerds over there too. You have to be if you're interested in this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, on our Bible app, we have a library of podcasts. And I don't know if you saw the form that we ask everybody to fill out to kind of self-identify what their podcast is about. But, well, we just take care to make sure that we're publishing things that are progressive in nature and not offensive to LGBTQ people, to women in leadership, to interfaith discussions. And you'd be surprised how hard that can be. And so we also publish daily devotionals. And what's really cool is that we have a publishing policy that makes sure that the theology that we're publishing is progressive, is friendly to everybody who reads it. And yeah, we just kind of took off from there. So of course there's, Bibles, and I'll admit we probably need some more. Yeah, we're just building a community with this app and trying to do it one devotional at a time.
Wonderful.
I'm really grateful that it exists. I think so much of the Bible apps that exist are more conservative, are not queer affirming at all, or don't affirm women in leadership, all of those things. And so when the Our Bible app, that was part of what I loved, was it was really intentional about, no, we're going to be progressive. We're going to affirm queer people. We're going to center queer people in the way that we do it. Yeah, so that was really cool.
Yeah, the way that I think of it is we have this amazing holy book, and in it are instructions to make an incredible life here on earth. And what I want to say evangelicals have done, or conservative Christians have done, is just pulled apart all the ingredients and said, well, we know that queer people shouldn't be involved, and just thrown that piece out, And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. We need to make sure that we're using all the ingredients that God gave us. And so that's what I think we're trying to do with our Bible app, is just incorporate all the different kinds of folks that read and interact with that holy text and theologize their personal experiences.
Yeah.
Sure. So today, for our episode, we're talking about Ash Wednesday, and one of the major focuses for Ash Wednesday is the importance of prayer in particular. And as Emily said, a lot of Christian prayer apps are super conservative. So does the Our Bible app have ways that a person can expand their prayer life if those other apps don't work for them?
Absolutely. What we are working with are daily meditations, and at the end of each daily devotional, there is a call to prayer or a call to action, where the idea is that the reader would be thoughtful about what it is they have just consumed, and figure out how to pray about it and then incorporate it into their lives. And so I think that prayer is a huge part of practice, that practice part, as if somebody says, I am a Christian. It means that you are practicing Christianity and putting it into the world.
Wonderful.
So, in connection with the devotions of our Bible app, you are working on an anthology right now called The Deconstructionist Playbook. So, can you tell us some about it, how you came up with the title?
Yeah.
What it means for you?
Oh man, this anthology is so super cool. So in the app, we have, I think, like 400 writers and so many more devotionals altogether. And we compiled a list of folks who have written about deconstruction and then sifted through each of their devotional days and found ones that talk about deconstruction, reconstruction, and liberation, and compiled that into a beautiful anthology it's coming out in March, but you can pre-order it starting February 1st through our Kickstarter.
Ooh, which will be 2 weeks before this episode actually airs.
Yes, right. So if you're listening to it, it's out there. You know what? So little has been said about deconstructionism on or published on deconstructionism from this like modern pseudo millennial voice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're going for, is to be able to talk about the ways that we in this time and place in history are taking apart the toxic theologies that were presented to us and are still floating around there, dismantling them and finding ways to liberate and incorporate more voices into that mixture. So that's where we're at. That's what we're doing. It's freaking awesome. I'm really excited.
Great.
Yeah, I think so. In the context of Ash Wednesday, that deconstructing, taking apart the things that have caused and still cause so much harm is not something that I think we're starting to talk about it more as how has Lent actually, in the concept of Lent, where we frequently it's, I'm going to give up chocolate for Lent or something like that. That's like, okay, but how does that actually like deepen your relationship with God and with other people? And so part of why we wanted to have you on for Ash Wednesday in particular is to start off the season of Lent with, how do we deconstruct the pieces of it that are harmful, the pieces of it that have contributed to eating disorders for people because they say you should fast, or
Wow.
the things that are like harmful in other ways to people. And then what does it look like, right? The next step is reconstruction, and what does that even look like? Yeah. I'm curious, like the deconstruction seems like almost the easier part in some ways, because we can point to the things that are harmful and say, okay, that needs to go away, that needs to be like explained and contextual, right? And we do that on our podcast, where we're like, okay, Paul said this, but like, let's put it in context. Let's talk about what he's talking about and put it in context of our culture too. It seems like reconstruction and the ways that like reconstruction is necessary for liberation is the harder part. I don't know if you found that, or like what you think about that, the piece of reconstruction that comes after the deconstruction.
It really is. I think that deconstruction is terrifying altogether, because you are, for whatever reason, you've kind of been like dispelled from this place of comfort and feeling like the world made absolute sense, and then you have this sudden enlightening moment where you're like, oh my gosh, there's a chink in the armor, like I can see through the matrix, like what's going on. And you have a choice, to either just stand your ground and buckle down, or like double down and, live your life in that bubble, or to explore outside of it. And there are the idea of going from cocoon to big open world where you're forced to actually use the tools of Christianity that you were given instead of just kind of like, sitting there and simmering in it is terrifying. And so that second part of, okay, well, I've thought about my belief systems. I've come to acknowledge that doubt is an important part of belief and faith. I have started to reconcile what I know about the Bible. I believe that God isn't necessarily a man. Once you start to like go through that and get some of that foundational stuff and thinking and processing done, then you start to move to restoration. And restoration for me, I feel like is very community driven. That's the place where you start to reach out and look for people and places that affirm these new ideas and these new feelings that you have about faith and spirituality. That's where you start to engage with whether or not it is okay to be LGBTQ, right? That's when you start to think about how social justice should be incorporated into your faith and what it is that you need to do because you are so spiritually compelled to do it, to save the world and blah, blah, blah. And I think that is also a place where you start to think about how to reframe God. And I feel like I'm still in that space where I am trying to comprehend how actually big and beautiful and ever present God is. And one of the questions that I've been tackling myself is, where does God not go? And that's stemming from this thing that was said in Seventh-day Adventism when I was a kid, that was, you can't go into movie theaters because the angels don't go in there with you. You will be without protection during the time you're in a movie theater, and that was all right. There was always like this, be in the world but not of it, because there's some places that God won't go with you. And I'm starting to realize, or I'm still working on the realization, that God is in the darkness too. There are really dark places you can and will go, and you will find God there, which is part of my restoration and ultimately liberation.
That actually reminds me, we just yesterday recorded, but our episode before this was on Transfiguration Sunday, which is like the transfiguration of Jesus in Mark 9. So it's Jesus on the mountaintop and his clothes, the like Mark text of it is that his clothes were dazzling, whiter than anyone on earth could bleach, which I had never noticed before, but I was like, I didn't know they could bleach again that day. But we had, for our special guest, a friend of mine whose name is Emily, and she's an artist, and we talked about this type of black paint. Well, it's black pigmentation, and it was developed for science, and there's like this whole art world controversy, and folks can listen to our previous episode if they want to know more, but the paint itself is so black, it absorbs all of the light. So Emily mentioned it, like, on the Wikipedia page for it, you can paint this black on a crumpled piece of tinfoil, and you can see the edges of the tinfoil and like tell that it is crumpled up. But where it's painted black, it just looks completely flat, which is a little bit besides the point. But what I was thinking about when you were talking about God being in the deep darkness is, when we were talking about it, part of why we wanted to have her on to talk about that was, nowadays, like, I could bleach anything a brilliant, dazzling white. Like, that's not hard, actually.
Right.
But what is hard is to, like, get your black to be super black and that, like, super rich black darkness.
Snaps to that. That really speaks to me.
Yeah. It's been one of the things that I, like, am super nerding out about these days. But it's just, like, that idea of, like, the language that was used in the Bible is not always helpful. And it's mired in, like, ableism, and our context of racism, particularly in the United States, makes talking about things like light and dark, white and black, problematic, particularly for us as white co-hosts of a podcast. And so then thinking about, like, well, where are the gifts of darkness? Where are the gifts of God's presence in blackness? Has been a gift that I've received from particularly Black people in my life and in the church, but is just, like, more fun to explore than where God is in the whiteness. Like, yeah.
Well, and I think I've noticed that as we've done this podcast, and I'm talking about Nerds at Church in particular, as opposed to the previous incarnation of our podcast, I've noticed that we wind up wandering off on tangents and discovering really interesting things on a regular basis. And sometimes we get more fascinated by that stuff than we were with the questions we actually had in mind in the first place. And I was wondering, Crystal, has that happened for you during your work for the Our Bible app or the Deconstructionist Playbook? Have you discovered new exciting tangents that you didn't expect while you've been making this new community of progressive Christians and discovering new ways of looking at faith?
Absolutely. When we're publishing daily devotionals, we really let the culture inform the choices that we make about themes and topics and, what we're asking folks to submit devotional wise. And I've been surprised at the things that, of course, I've been surprised at the things that people are talking about, and I think how freaking smart people are. I think one of the things that comes to mind is when we were starting to compile the deconstructionist playbook, we were only going to go from deconstruction to reconstruction or restoration, coming back to a place of goodness and health. But then we started to do some digging and learning about like womanist theology and liberation theology. And liberation theology was originally founded in the Latin American community, women, and is driven in topics of race and being at war with what society has to offer, like capitalism and all this stuff. And starting to like really read into it, we thought, no, we actually need to incorporate this also, because it's more than just we ourselves becoming better people. It is becoming a better community and becoming better and ultimately ushering in some kind of heaven on earth with what we're actually capable of doing. And yeah, I was really excited to start to incorporate that and use some more author voices. So that's why we have 60 writers and not like 10. Because I'm constantly discovering more.
That's fantastic. As you were talking, I was thinking about that, and I was like, oh yeah, like deconstruction is taking away the harm somewhat collectively, but also like there's a very real, like each of us have been harmed by religion in different ways. And then reconstruction is the like, okay, how do I recreate a faith? Like, what does it look like as I create a faith, as I like figure out what faith means to me? And then you started talking about liberation. It's like, yes, that's the like, we're like half a second after my brain was like, what about the community? You were like, and liberation. Yes.
Yes.
That is, I mean, and that's how God works. That's how Jesus works. Like we are at a disadvantage in the English language because we've gotten rid of the plural you, unless we're like in the South, which my dad's from Georgia. So like y'all is part of my vernacular, but it's not in, I wish we translated the Bible with y'all because
whereas I sound completely ridiculous when I try to use the word y'all. It does not.
Okay, but you're also like a weird northerner, midwesterner person, so.
Thank you.
But what I love about it, right, is that if we actually translated biblically the yous to like, even if it was just you with like the little like PL in parentheses afterwards, like, but to indicate when Jesus or Paul or anybody is talking, or God is talking about you as a plural, we would hardly have any singular yous left. Like the majority of the time, it's talking about plural and collective liberation, like you're talking about. But English is just like
broken.
A broken language is not the best language for conveying that.
I really love that. I really, really love that because it goes back. It goes right back to the beginning of Adam and Eve, and man is not made to be alone. That should echo throughout the Bible. And wow, you kind of blew my socks off there for a second. That's great, y'all.
I mean, I'm biased because I just love y'all, and it's more fun to say.
I use it all the time too. Catherine, get in on it. Just do it.
You can do it, Kay. We can practice on the podcast. I don't know how, because it's usually just two of us, but...
I appreciate the support. Thank you. I'm not really sure how it would translate to my rural southern Minnesota context, but because I also don't want to come off sounding like I'm making fun of people who use the word y'all.
That would be counterproductive for your context.
That's not helpful.
Know thyself. Know thyself.
Yeah, fair. One of the things that I was really intrigued by, and it's a couple questions ago, but you were talking, when Kay asked about like prayer life, you talked about at the end of the devotions, there's a prayer or a call to action. And I was like, oh, like two different types of praying, right? The way I was taught to pray was like, fold your hands, bow your head, talk to the corner, therein lies prayer. And that has never resonated with me. And it hasn't been until my first call as a pastor that somebody gave me the book Praying in Color by Sybil Macbeth that was like doodle prayers, and that like all of a sudden just cracked open like what even is prayer. But part of it also, like in the course of this last summer, I'm in Des Moines, so we've had a lot of protesting and a lot of police brutality. And part of it is like, so I was one of the people arrested, and then afterwards, like the news reporters I was the only clergy person that was arrested at that time, and so they wanted to like do an interview. And so in the interview, they were asking, like, they were trying to get at like, so supporting protesters is like you're at church for your day job and then you support protesters. And I was like, no, like the showing up is praying, is showing up with our bodies where our values are, right? But the accident, like all of the people who have been protesting this year, and I don't want to like impose my perspective on them, but I see, especially for folks who are people of faith, those prayers, right? That the act of showing up to protests, of marching, of resisting police brutality is praying with our bodies, praying with our whole selves for a world that is liberated, a world of abolition of policing and criminal injustice and the whole prison industrial complex, right? But it is this active thing. So when you said like, yeah, at the end there's prayer and there's calls to action, I was like, yes, there's like prayer and more prayer. I was just going to say, I'm curious if you have thought about those two pieces as connected in the way that you're thinking about the devotions and the deconstructionist playbook in particular.
I hadn't. I've always believed that we are God's hands, and God's feet. And it doesn't do much to just sit and think about it and pray on it and meditate on what you want to see in the world. You actually have to go out and do it. So your description, I feel, just like really jives with that and brings to mind a phrase that I often use, which is pews to the protest, from the pews to the protest. And it's like, you should be invigorated by the church that you are in community with to go out and do. And this isn't part of your question, but I moved to Philadelphia 11 years ago, and at the time was just coming out of Adventism and did a lot of church hopping, trying to find a place where I could find a home, and eventually just gave up. And I was at the time of deconstruction and, figuring out restoration and how to incorporate the church into my life. And at the time, it meant that I needed to take a break from it and figure out what my values were. What were the things that I was passionate about? What was I looking for in a church body? And ultimately, I did find a church about 2 years ago. This wonderful place. It's a UCC and a Presbyterian church, which is just a reflection of the diversity in that space. The minister is a lesbian. And there's just beautiful families all throughout the congregation. And what made me want to become a member there was just seeing and experiencing how much they care about the community that they're in. And the church itself is on the border between this extremely gentrified area of West Philly and, what is considered to be, an impoverished and poorer area of the city. And they do their work to make sure that those with means show up for those without means. And that includes having sack lunches for the homeless. That includes, we were what is it called if you need to stay at a church because you are an immigrant and you are claiming
sanctuary.
Yes,
yeah.
We were a sanctuary congregation for this family for a while. And I mean, just those kinds of things, the way that my community cares, a church community cares about the greater community and actually shows up to those spaces, just is, I feel like, the crowning piece of what it meant to be part of a church body and why I wanted to continue to worship there. But the giving back to the community, I feel like, is a beautiful part of that prayer life. And you know what? Maybe in the app we need to come up with another way for folks to pray, like squiggling or having a journal or something is something we talked about for a while. Who knows?
That would be so cool to do like an Our Bible app journal, and then to have like you have devotions, but you also have prompts, and you have like pages that are lined and pages that are not lined. Oh my gosh, that would be so much fun. If you ever do that.
I'll
You're
hit you
open
up.
to it. Okay, I was like, I want to do that with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be really cool.
I think all of this really speaks to one of the most exciting realizations I think I ever had growing up was that we truly do create the community we live in. Like, it's not that human society is a unmoving, solid thing that you can't change or push or do anything with, but like we make the decisions that form the society that we live in. And the really exciting part of starting ministry work for me was realizing you can do the same thing with the church.
Mm.
The church is not a unchanging, immovable object. You can make the church reflect who you are, who the world is, what the world needs, that kind of thing. And it really sounds like the community you've been building through the Our Bible app and your other work is exactly the same thing. It's being able to reflect the world with the church. And I think that's wonderful.
It's all about relationships, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it, Kay.
So, Crystal, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
You know what? I always have so many thoughts, but today I'm a little dry.
I mean, you've had a lot of thoughts. Like,
yes,
don't tell yourself
you're putting them in the playbook. That's what that's for.
They're going into the playbook. But if people are curious about me, they can always find me on all the social medias as Crystal Cheatham, or on or with Our Bible app as Our Bible app. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks for
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Our first reading for this episode comes from Joel chapter 2, verses 1-2 and 12 through 17. The prophet Joel instructs the people to repent, because the day of God is coming. But God remains gracious and merciful. So one of the things that I noticed in this passage is the announcements, but the way that Joel's talking about, like, make the announcements. And as everyone knows by now, I am making my way through the Ember and the Ashes book series, and I'm on the 4th book. Almost done, and it's the new book, and it's so good, but I have work, and so I can't just, like, read it all. But throughout this series, the Marshals, which is one of the, like, groups of people, all of their announcements are made via drums. And so they, like, drum out some complicated code or whatever to say, like, this is what's going on, or everybody go here, or
sure,
the Karkans are coming, or whatever the case may be. So I was thinking about the different ways that announcements are made. That was the only one that I could think of where there was, like, a clear, this is how we make announcements, out of all of the, like, things.
Lord of the Rings, the lights lit for Gondor.
Oh, yeah, the beacons.
Yes, the beacons, thank you. Why could I not think of the word beacons? Yes.
That's true.
Although that's like one very specific message, not, many kinds of messages. So that's right.
I think I remember thinking about Lord of the Rings and the beacons, and maybe that's why I ended up not putting it. It was because it's like,
okay,
there's an announcement.
That's fair. In verse 13, we hear God say to us to rend your hearts and not your clothing, to actually have the emotions rather than focusing on the appearance of what the emotion should be, you might say.
Mm.
In this case, the emotion we're talking about is grief. Rending your clothing was a way to, and still is in some places, a way to signal to others that you are grieving, whether or not you're actually grieving, like maybe it's a signal that you're supposed to be grieving, depending on your relationship with the person who's died. But a rended heart, on the other hand, means that you actually are grieving. Your heart is torn. It has been ripped, basically. This thought of rend your hearts and not your clothing, and the fact that someone apparently has to be told this, reminds me of an episode of The Twilight Zone called The Masks, in which there is a rich old man who is dying, and his family comes to visit, his daughter and her family, specifically, and we realize, really, they're not visiting because they care about him. They're visiting to make sure that they get their share of his inheritance. And he insists that they wear masks for part of the evening, and it gets steadily weirder from there. But it's very much an episode centered around what does it mean, what does it look like when you are claiming that you're grieving for social obligations, appearances' sake, but you actually don't care.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I was looking at that verse also and thinking about what Crystal was talking about reconstruction and restoration of our faith. and that it's not, right, and you kind of talked about this, but it's not about rending your clothing so much. It's not about the like ways that we have been taught to outwardly express our faith in ways that are like kind of superficial, but like ways that signal things. It's funny because I've served as a pastor in a variety of congregations, and there's this sense, particularly in like predominantly white Scandinavian congregations, of like piety being a very private thing, but even that is a visible like sign, right?
Right.
And so this is a very different thing where it is like what is at the heart of yourself and your faith and your emotions. And so getting to the heart of things, rending your heart, is getting to the heart of what it looks like to have, like, what is your faith? What makes up your faith? What are the values that you experience and you love? And it kind of also reminded me of the Cinder series. It's a series that, like, each of the books is kind of based on a different fairy tale, but it's in like this world where there are cyborgs.
Okay.
It's the Lunar series. There are people who have lived on the moon who have developed this ability to put up a front, basically, to like make other people see them in a particular way that's not necessarily realistic to who they are.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And I forget what it's called, but the appearance versus the reality kind of things. And that, like, part of it is getting at the heart of who people really are. And so Cinder, one of the characters, like, can't do that and doesn't know about doing that. And so just like her heart's on her sleeve, like she can't hide who she is, even though she gets discriminated against because she's a cyborg and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Our second reading for this episode is from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 1 through 12. And depending on what your congregation does, this may be an alternate reading. The prophet Isaiah reminds the people that sackcloth and ashes is one way to repent, but God would rather they repent by destroying injustice and feeding the hungry.
Truth.
Yeah.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of liberation, and Crystal talked about it, and this, like, the idea of liberation being the collective rather than the individual. And I was thinking about this, and X-Men was what came to mind for me, because the original, like, X-Men comics focused a lot on racism.
Yeah.
And so the, like, liberation from racism and the analogies of the like connections were made to the way that racism was harmful. And then the movie trilogy did a similar thing, but with queerphobia, especially homophobia. But like, I'm always reminded of the like coming out story of Iceman and his parents saying, "Did you ever try not being a mutant?" And it's like,
that was a little more spot on than I was expecting.
Yeah, it was super spot on. But that's like one of the things that I love about X-Men is that there's so much about like liberation and about being different and then being liberated from the systems that hold us captive, that harm us or that try to harm those who are different.
And I think X-Men also, both in the comics and some of the movies, did a nice job of acknowledging that doesn't mean everything's going to be easier either. They were very good about pointing out that bad still exists. Like the character Rogue, who can't touch people. You know, her mutation is not a fun one. She doesn't get to, you know, create storms or anything. And so they did a nice job of acknowledging that doesn't mean your life is going to be easier or like magical or that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And they explore different ways of seeking liberation, right? Like there is the somewhat assimilated liberation of like, let's try to treat each other equally. And there's also the like, no, y'all are never going to treat us equally, so we are against you kind of stuff that is actually reminiscent of, in some ways, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, though they started to come together and like, I think we're on their way to trading places. Maybe not fully trading places, but like we're coming together.
Wouldn't the world be such an extraordinary place if they were both still alive? Yeah.
Yeah. So diving into this passage, in the second half of verse 3, we hear, Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day and oppress all your workers. So in the previous one, I was talking about like reconstruction and restoration and liberation, but this is very much a like, let's deconstruct the ways that your religion is harmful. Like, let's name them, call them out,
yes,
and change them. And I was thinking, particularly in the sense of like serving your own interests on your fast days, I was thinking about like white women tears and like white people tears, where particularly around conversations around racism, when white people, and especially a lot of times white women, are called out for doing or saying something racist, the way that they respond is with tears.
Yeah.
Right. And so then instead of taking responsibility for the harm that they've caused, they make themselves into the victim. And in that way, like, then it furthers the oppression.
And sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes they don't even realize what they're doing by it.
Yeah, it's so ingrained in us as white people to be avoidant of conflict and to not want to appear to be the wronger in a situation, even though that is frequently like what happens. So intentional or otherwise, they make themselves into the victim, right. And in that way then further the oppression against the Black, Indigenous person of color who was like calling them out and realistically being called out, right? Being called out in the sense of like, you're serving your own interest on a fast day is a gift to that person,
yeah.
Right? Because the people who don't get called out are the people that have been given up on. I know this as a like trans and non-binary person who has to frequently correct pronouns, and I pick and choose who I correct because some people are not worth it. So like, if you're getting corrected, it's because somebody has decided that you are worth it to put that effort in.
You're so welcome.
Like, yeah, appreciate it. You're welcome.
Yeah. In verse 10, we hear, "If you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness and your gloom be like the noonday." Okay, I'm going to blow your minds, because guess what? It turns out it's actually very easy for your church to grow, if that's what you want. Just be sure that that's what you want first. That is the trick. This verse right here is actually the secret of getting your congregation to grow. You get out into the community, and you fill needs that are there, and you don't be a jerk while you're doing it. That last part is surprisingly important. If you're being a jerk, that's not going to help. I feel like "don't be a jerk" should be a Christian bumper sticker.
I mean, enough Christians need to know that. Yeah.
But no, if you do this, if you get out into the community, find needs that are there, and then fill them, whether that's food or childcare or a clothes closet or medical care, my goodness, or medical debt. Mm-hmm. If you do that, your church will grow. Like, once people realize that you are there to help people and you are not there to be a jerk about it, your church will grow. Now, granted, the people who show up may not be the respectable middle-class people you were originally hoping for, because, yes, I've been with congregations like this. They are always hoping for respectable middle to upper middle-class people who have money. Mm-hmm. So change is going to need to happen in your congregation, because that's also what happens when you grow, which surprises a lot of people. But if you genuinely want to grow, this is how to do it. It's not actually that complicated. It's just people don't actually enjoy it.
Yep.
So
it's amazing. People only want to grow and not change. Yes, not
we
only,
want people like
frequently.
us, and who will continue doing exactly what we've been doing.
Yep. Like us, or maybe slightly wealthier.
That would be okay.
Wealthy. Just like a little bit more money.
Yeah, we don't want people who brag about their 8 yachts, but if they happen to have a nice little boat on the lake that they could take us out and have hot dogs on Sunday afternoons, that would be cool. So.
Yep. Our next passage for Ash Wednesday is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20b through chapter 6, verse 10. A life of faith can involve many difficulties, tragedies, and injustices. But God is with us through everything, and we can act with love through all of it, with God's help. So one of the themes that I noticed in this passage is the sense of urgency that Paul is talking about. Paul definitely is speaking, and I think we've mentioned this a little bit throughout our takes on the Corinthians passages in the season after Epiphany, but there's this urgency that Paul has of like, now is the time.
Yes.
And I was thinking about that urgency, and like, that's an urgency that superheroes basically always have. Like, they never wait for the cops. It's always like, no, we gotta act now. We don't have time to wait for the cops. Which, like, part of me is like, good, don't wait for the cops. They are dangerous anyway. But also, so are superheroes if we were really thinking about it that way.
That's fair.
But, like, yeah, I was like, yeah, they like never wait for cops. There is never a time. Even when they're like trying to work with the cops, they end up like, no, we don't have time to wait for them to arrive. We just have to go now.
I mean, to be fair, they also don't wait for firefighters. It's not just cops.
Also true.
Yeah.
Or EMTs. Like, they just don't wait for emergency responders.
No.
Anybody that's like paid to do the thing.
No. Well, like, sometimes, I mean, I suppose they do wait for the medics. Like, they will, but that's after they do their thing. Like, they will hang out with the person who's been injured until the medics get there. But
well, unless it's like a super emergency, in which case they risk the person being paralyzed by like scooping them up and just bringing them to the hospital.
Yeah, having never gotten any training whatsoever on how to do that properly.
On how to like stabilize the neck and back and
If you really want to learn things that you never actually wanted to know, watch a superhero movie with an EMT sometime.
Or watch Grey's Anatomy with anyone in the medical profession.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
Yeah, I like, even just as a hospital chaplain, I'm like, nope. I can't watch the new season because it's too much pandemic stuff.
Yeah.
And nobody's wearing PPE properly in the shows, so
because you have to be able to see their face because it's TV.
Well, but even the like N95s, they're like, you can see gaps of air that can get through, and it's like, that's not how it's supposed to work. Also, you're not supposed to cover your ears so that you don't have to use the microphone things because you can hear people fine, but they need the microphones in order to hear people for the show, and that's just a whole. In verse 3, we read, "We are putting no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry." And it actually reminded me of the Great British Baking Show, Bake Off, which I love. It is like the best cooking show ever.
Yes.
Baking show ever, I think, because it's so British, right? Like, in the US, all of the like competitive baking shows are like, there's some sort of sabotage, or either the contestants are sabotaged, or they sabotage each other, or the judges are just, like, mean and cruel, and...
Or everybody's so whiny. And then there's all that, like, really exciting background music that you can't listen to that kind of music while you're baking. It's going to ruin the baking. The souffle's going to fall.
Right. And, like, it just, like, ramps up the anxiety.
Yeah.
But the Great British Baking Show is so British. So, like... They literally don't put obstacles in anyone's way. All of them want to be the best baker, the star baker, and at the same time, they don't want to do it at the expense of like other people like messing up or like by putting obstacles in other people's ways. They want to be the best baker out of an entire group that is able to do their best. Yes. And that is just, like, so beautiful, and I love it, and it makes my heart so warm, and that is what I was thinking of when I read verse 3. I was like, oh, it's like British baking. We are trying to, like, not put obstacles in anyone's way, but to get everybody to be able to do their best.
It's a reconstruction of what we love about cooking shows.
Yes.
In verse 6... we hear Paul say, "We have commended ourselves by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love." And this is how the movie, Legally Blonde, gets us to root for the character Elle Woods. I realize that some of the people listening to this podcast may not have been, like, watching movies when this movie first came out, because it's been a while now. But the thing about Legally Blonde was that when it came out, Elle Woods was actually kind of breaking ground in terms of rich blonde girls were not understood to be nice. Girls that cared about fashion were not understood to care about other people. And
they definitely did not have any sort of intelligence.
Right, and a character that, like, had a tiny little Chihuahua dog was not supposed to be someone you cared about, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Admittedly, it broke ground in some weird ways, but it did the job. And it took a female character that everyone would have been dismissive of before and made us care about her and root for her. And they did that by showing that she is actually a kind and patient person, which was super unusual for her character trope at the time.
Yeah. I did not expect to like Legally Blonde, and then I really did. And it's because of those things that it was, particularly as someone who was blonde and smart growing up, to have like someone who was blonde and smart and all of those things that like put words and put an image to what was so frustrating for me about the assumptions people would make.
Yeah. See, whereas I was coming from the point of view of the blonde smart girls were the ones that were trying to make my life hell in high school. And I was reminded that actually people like this can still be nice. They can still be decent people. That's probably a good thing to be reminded of.
You know, setting us both up for success and friendship.
Yes, exactly. Our gospel reading for Ash Wednesday is from Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, and verses 16 through 21. Jesus encourages us to give to charity, and to pray and to fast, but not for appearance's sake, or to improve our reputation.
So one of the themes in this passage that I noticed was the idea of superficiality. So just the surface things, right? To give to charity, to pray, to fast, all of that stuff for appearance sake. And unconnected to Kay, I also thought of Legally Blonde. But I was thinking about the way that Elle Woods appears, and in a actually very similar way to how Kay does, that Elle Woods seems very superficial because of the stereotypes about blonde, attractive women with small dogs.
Yes.
But actually has so much depth. It's just not recognized. And she doesn't care really about the fact that nobody is recognized. Like, the things that matter to her are the things that are deeper. Her care and her compassion and her work for justice and
getting Paula her dog back.
And getting Paula her dog back. Those are things that are important for Elle, and they're just like other people just don't recognize them. And she's like, well, that doesn't matter. I know that these are, and the times when she does come into conflict with people who won't recognize those deeper things is when it gets in the way of her doing what she is called to do.
Yeah.
But I love that sense of like, fine, you all have this view of me, but like, here's the actual heart of it. And she kind of, for me, as I mentioned, like she restored, there was a restoration of like the affirmation of who I was in those movies that I think is in some ways similar to the restoration that and the reconstruction that Crystal was talking about with deconstructing the harmful things and then coming back to like, what are the things that are important? How do we value God and ourselves in ways that we haven't been able to in the past?
Like, it turns out that seeing women as people is actually a deeply feminist thing, and that's what that movie did.
Yeah. So when we get to verse 3, we read, "But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing." And it reminded me of the Unwind Young Adult Dystopia series by Neil Shusterman, which is the only young adult dystopia that that's written by a man that I think is worth anything. And the way it works is there's no abortions necessarily, but by the time a kid reaches the age of 13, parents can like retroactively say, maybe we made a mistake in having this kid. And then the kids get sent to these camps and then get unwound, and their body parts get donated to other people who like have had accidents or that sort of a thing. And so
that's dark. Okay.
It's bad. So it's a complicated thing, and it's like pretty intense sometimes. It's been a while since I read it.
Yeah, I We've been talking about the same, like, 3 dystopias over and over again for the last several episodes, and so I just was kind of taken aback by this one, but okay, sure.
Yeah, it's a very different kind, and I read it when I was still in Minnesota, I think. But the idea is, like, if you, like, got your hand cut off in an accident, you could get somebody else's hands. And at one point, they, like, create...
From a 13-year-old.
Yeah. At one point, they create a person out of just different parts of other people's bodies. But they all, like, they match the nerves and all.
Do they name them Frank?
That stuff. No. But there's this idea, right, like, that it's different people's hands. And so, like, yes, your hands know what they're doing, but also there's this sense of, like, if my left hand is from this person and my right hand is from this person, then do they really know what they're doing? What the other is doing? So that's where my mind went.
Yeah, wow. Okay.
I think it's a really
No, it's a perfectly sensible connection. I see it.
Yeah.
I
think the dystopia... I'm not necessarily giving it, like, all the credit it's due, because there's an extent to which it really does, like, bring into question, like, what does it look like to donate organs, and in this, like, future dystopic thing of we're living in a world that's not sustainable as it is, how do we like adjust that? And yeah,
there's an old philosophy illustration of that, of imagine a wooden ship from the old days, a wooden sailing ship. And over time, it keeps getting fixed and repaired, and old planks that are falling apart are taken out and new planks are put on. And so at what point, as the planks are replaced, does it become a different ship than the one it was originally?
Yeah, that's a good question.
At what point is it no longer the ship it was? Or is it just always the same ship, even 200 years later, when it's a completely different set of planks? I went against the grain and broke the rules, and I know Emily hates it when people do that, but...
Hey now, do not put those words in my mouth.
Sarcasm is still a thing, Emily. The next thing that I came up with a connection for was verse 7, which is technically not within this reading, but our podcast is aimed at lay people, and I like to expand on what the lectionary gives you. And I think that this thought actually, like, I see no reason why they couldn't have just extended this reading one more verse to include this one, because this is something that happens in real life.
Mm-hmm.
So in verse 7, despite the fact that it's not technically in the reading, we hear, when you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Gee, none of us have ever met someone like that.
Not at all.
But what this makes me think of is that when you read novels that were written, and sometimes even just set, in the 17 and 1800s, one of the fastest ways when they introduce a new character who happens to be a minister, the fastest way to see whether or not that person is going to be any good at their job, or, like, at all competent, or even just a decent human being, is very often the first way they'll introduce a minister is to describe one of his prayers. And yes, it's always a hymn, because this is 200 years ago. Except, I suppose, if you're talking about the Shakers, but they don't show up that often.
I was going to say, it's actually like 200 to 300 years ago.
I know, we're old.
It is 2021 now, despite our best efforts.
But very often, the first thing that, when you meet a new minister in one of these older novels, the first thing that will happen is that they will pray, because usually you meet them, like, at a meal or at a service or something like that, and so usually they pray right off the bat. And they give you a hint about what kind of person this minister is going to be by how the prayer is described. Like, they don't usually, like, write it out word for word, but they'll say, and the minister said a prayer about this, and...
Or the minister droned on and on.
Yes, if the minister drones on, and there is no real content in the prayer, nobody understands what he's actually talking about, he's going to be a completely useless kind of person, okay? He'll be in the background, he'll occasionally irritate people, he's not actually going to contribute usefully to the plot, or to help anyone. On the other hand, if his prayers are noted as being remarkably content-filled, not usually very long, mostly pretty simple language, straightforward, just talking like a normal person, then they will probably be reasonably compassionate, they will care about their congregation, and they will usually be a fairly useful person to know and actually like helping people. So that is shorthand in those older novels for what is this minister going to be like. And you don't get as many like truly evil ministers in those older books, but very often you can kind of get that feeling. They will be in the droning on and not actually saying anything useful camp, and then you get the sinister feeling as time goes on. So
Interesting. I feel like you could do that with some ministers today. Just gonna say.
Oh, I'm not saying that this does not actually apply in real life. It totally does. I'm
I'm like super self-conscious about like, I pray a lot as a chaplain.
Yeah, no, well, and so many
people.
Am
I praying?
Like, one of the things that I struggle with when I'm working in a church setting is I do try to get people more comfortable with the idea of praying out loud, because so many people that I meet are just wildly uncomfortable with the idea of praying in a way that anyone else can hear them. And so the way I start with that is I try to train people to get to the point where they're comfortable leading others in the Lord's Prayer. That is the first step. Because usually that's a prayer they're pretty comfortable with. Which is
the part that's missing in this passage, just in case you're curious.
Oddly enough. And so you start them off by getting them willing to pray, to lead others in saying the Lord's Prayer. And once they get comfortable with that, then you can say, okay, what about a table grace? And then once they're comfortable with that, you can say, okay, what about a different table grace? and moving into like, okay, what if we just said a very, very short prayer for like this person's health? Do you think you could do that? And baby steps, So.
Nice. I like it. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss the nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the first Sunday in Lent. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts.
Including the Our Bible app.
Absolutely. If you appreciate what we do, or you want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that, though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christian said, Pax vobiscum.